Each year, military forces advancing through the ruins of defeated regimes uncover installations so deliberately erased from every map, every blueprint, and every chain of command that their very existence forces historians and intelligence analysts to reconsider the absolute limits of what governments authorize in the name of wartime necessity. It happens with a consistency that classified departments within the Pentagon, MI6, and what would eventually become the Bundesnachrichtendienst have long since stopped treating as coincidence, channeling hundreds of millions of dollars annually into programs designed not to investigate these sites, but to ensure that what was found inside them never reaches public knowledge, because public knowledge, in these cases, would require public explanation, and no government on Earth has ever developed an explanation that holds. The Second World War mobilized over 16 million American service members across 2 hemispheres, grinding through 5 years of industrial-scale slaughter that produced 60 million dead worldwide, and reduced entire capitals to landscapes of rubble and ash. And yet, for all its documented horror, the conflict's most disturbing chapter was never entered into any history book available to the general public. Berlin in April of 1945 was a city in the process of becoming its own grave. 892 square kilometers of the Brandenburg Plateau reduced to approximately 60% structural debris, its surviving inhabitants numbering fewer than 2 million in a metropolis built for 4. Its streets navigable only in single file between mountains of pulverized concrete that had once been among the most architecturally celebrated buildings in Europe. For a brief period during the final weeks of the European theater, as elements of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division tore through the dying architecture of the Third Reich's capital, one 8-man reconnaissance squad operating in the Mitte District would descend through a ventilation shaft in a collapsed foundation and find something so fundamentally incompatible with any accepted understanding of biology, military science, or the limits of human experimentation that the United States government would spend the following 4 decades burying every trace of what those men encountered beneath an avalanche of falsified casualty reports and forged psychiatric evaluations. But what exactly was the entity that American soldiers found sealed inside a sub-basement beneath the ruins of Berlin's most bombed district? And why does Private Luther Emmett appear in official military records as killed in action on April 28, 1945, 24 hours before he descended into that shaft and looked at something that, by every surviving account, looked back? Berlin in the spring of 1945 was not a city so much as an autopsy, a vast, smoking post-mortem of a civilization that had consumed itself from the inside out over 12 years of ideological acceleration that ended, as all such accelerations end, in the specific stillness of total structural collapse. The Mitte District, the administrative and historical heart of the capital, had absorbed a disproportionate share of the RAF and USAAF bombing campaigns, precisely because it contained the densest concentration of government infrastructure, and by late April it had been reduced to a landscape that combat veterans of Sicily and Anzio, men who had seen their share of destroyed cities, described in their letters home with a consistency that suggests they were all reaching for the same inadequate word: wrong. Not destroyed in the way that war destroys things, but wrong in a more fundamental sense, as if the district had been unmade rather than damaged, the rubble arranged in patterns that suggested intention rather than physics. Beneath all of it, extending downward in a warren of tunnels, utility corridors, and sub-basement chambers that predated the Reich by decades, in some cases by centuries, lay a subterranean Berlin that most of the soldiers now moving through its surface had no idea existed. The city's sandy Brandenburg soil, geologically unstable and perpetually waterlogged at depth, had paradoxically produced a culture of deep construction, foundations sunk far below standard European practice, utility networks running at levels that peacetime engineers had found economical and wartime planners had found strategically invaluable. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that in a city so thoroughly destroyed above ground, the most dangerous thing it still contained was hidden well below it, and that the unit tasked with finding structural hazards ahead of the main column's advance would be the one to find it, because finding things that should not exist is, in the end, simply a function of looking in the right direction at the wrong moment. The ground beneath the MIT district had been host to documented darkness long before the National Socialists discovered its utility. Medieval Prussian chronicles from the 13th century record what monks of the Neckeleviertel called the Kellergeister, the cellar spirits, described in the ecclesiastical Latin of the period as formless presences that established residence in the deep foundations of buildings, raised on certain specific patches of the district's soil, particularly along the axis running between what is now Spandauer Strasse and the eastern bank of the Spree. A 1387 entry in the Berliner Stadtbuch, the city's earliest surviving administrative record, documents the forced demolition of a tannery on Strahlower Strasse following the death of its owner and 3 apprentices in the building's basement, their bodies arranged in a configuration that the official municipal scribe described with a precision that suggests he had looked at it long enough to want to stop looking, as nicht von Menschen gemacht, not made by human hands. The church's official position, maintained for 4 centuries, was that these incidents reflected isolated diabolical influence on susceptible minds. The unofficial position, preserved in sealed Vatican correspondence, only partially declassified in 1998, was considerably more alarmed and contained in a letter from a papal legate dated 1511 the specific recommendation that no ecclesiastical construction of any kind be undertaken in the mid-district below a depth of 4 meters, a recommendation offered without explanation and followed in every documented case of subsequent church construction in Berlin without question. The modern military record with the MIT sub-basement begins not in 1945, but in 1938, when SS Sturmband 4 Heinrich Kamp, an engineer assigned to the Ahnenerbe's infrastructure division, submitted a classified memorandum to Reichsfuhrer Himmler that cross-referenced the medieval Stadtbuch entries with 3 separate Wehrmacht construction incidents between 1933 and 1937, all in the MIT district, all involving workers who reported auditory phenomena in the sub-basement levels and subsequently suffered acute psychotic breaks requiring institutional commitment. Kamp's memorandum, recovered in partial form from SS administrative archives seized at war's end and classified by the IS within 72 hours of discovery, concluded with a recommendation whose final visible sentence, the remainder having been deliberately excised from the document at some point before its OS classification, reads, was unter der Mitte ist, war immer unter der Mitte, and is war sich immer dessen bewusst, was aber im ist. What is below the Mitte has always been below the Mitte, and it has always been aware of what is above it. Himmler's response to Kamp's memorandum is not in the recovered archive. What is in the archive, filed under a project designation that translates approximately as Crown of Flesh, is a construction authorization dated November 1943, a procurement order for electrical equipment of unusual specifications, sourced through 3 separate front companies, and a personnel roster of 23 individuals, listed not by name but by prisoner number, a detail that requires no elaboration for anyone familiar with how the SS sourced its experimental subjects in the war's final years. April 29, 1945, 1340 hours. Staff Sergeant Elroy Hatchett Dunbar, 26 years old, construction worker from Wheeling, West Virginia, enlisted 4 days after Pearl Harbor, survived the landings at Sicily, the bloodbath at Anzio, and 14 months on the Gothic Line without a scratch that required more than field dressing, was moving his 8-man reconnaissance element through the mid-rubble field on a structural assessment tasked to run 2 hours and produce a hazard map for the main column's advance. The temperature was holding at 48 degrees Fahrenheit under a solid gray overcast, the air carrying the particular compound smell of wet concrete dust and something sweetly organic that every man in the element had long since learned to identify and breathed through without comment, because commenting on it required acknowledging what it was, and acknowledging what it was served no operational purpose. Alongside Dunbar moved Corporal Augustine Gus Fleischer, 24, a German-American from Milwaukee, whose civilian German had become the squad's most valuable non-military asset over the past 3 months of European operations. Private First Class Tobias Renshaw, 19, from Baton Rouge, the youngest member of the element, and the one most likely, per Dunbar's private assessment, to do something impulsive under pressure. Technical Corporal Samuel Oduya, 28, from Columbus, former collegiate wrestler. Signals trained, the person Dunbar most trusted to maintain function when function became difficult. And 4 privates whose names appear in the subsequent classified record only as initials, a redaction that is itself a form of information. Private Luther Emmett, 22, from Savannah, Georgia, a quiet man who had demonstrated throughout the Italian campaign a capacity for stillness under pressure that Dunbar had come to rely on the way a surgeon relies on a particular instrument, was the one who found the shaft. It was protruding from a collapsed foundation at the intersection of 2 rubble fields, a ventilation housing approximately 60 centimeters in diameter, intact, welded shut, completely unmarked, and oriented in a direction that suggested the structure it had once served extended significantly deeper than the surrounding debris indicated. What stopped Dunbar from marking it on his hazard map and moving on was not intuition, not training, not any identifiable professional instinct. It was the sound. Faint, rhythmic, rising from below the welded housing with a regularity that ruled out wind, ruled out settling debris, ruled out every passive acoustic source that Dunbar's 3 years of combat experience had loaded into his unconscious threat assessment library. He would write in a statement 6 days later, in the careful handwriting of a man trying to be precise about something that resisted precision. It sounded like breathing, but wrong, like something that had learned what breathing should sound like from a description rather than from doing it. Fleischer pressed his ear to the shaft housing for 11 seconds. Renshaw counted, later, because counting had given him something to do with his mind during those 11 seconds, before pulling back with an expression that 3 separate witness accounts describe identically, as the color leaving his face in a specific sequence, forehead first, then cheeks, like a tide going out. He said, in a voice kept flat with visible effort, that the sound was not mechanical, that it had rhythm and variation, that it had changed when he made contact with the metal, shifted slightly in frequency and cadence, as though it had registered the vibration of his touch and adjusted in response. Dunbar ordered Oduya to cut the weld. It took 4 minutes with a field torch. The shaft opened into a vertical drop of 9 feet, ending in a concrete corridor lit by a single string of electric bulbs still functioning on what had to be an independent generator, because the district's power grid had been dead for 11 days. The air that rose from the opening was warm, which was wrong, and it carried a smell that Renshaw described in his subsequent statement as ozone mixed with something organic, like a hospital that had gone bad in a specific way that wasn't rot, like the hospital smell, but past it, on the other side of it. All 8 men reported that their watches stopped at the moment the shaft opened. Not slowed, not gained. Stopped, all of them simultaneously, all displaying the same incorrect time of 11:47, which was not the time and had not been the time at any point during the mission. Dunbar's military compass began rotating slowly and continuously to the left, a failure mode that compasses do not have. Oduya's minus 536 Seychelles rupees handy-talkie produced a clear, sustained, low-frequency tone on every frequency. Not static, not interference, but a single held note, as if something below was transmitting on all channels simultaneously and had only one thing to say. They went down anyway. They were soldiers, and going down was what soldiers did, and none of them would have been able to articulate, in the moment, any reason why going down into a warm shaft in a bombed-out basement in a dying city with a compass that had stopped working was anything other than the logical next step. That inability to articulate a reason for hesitation was, in retrospect, the first thing that should have concerned them. The corridor extended 40 meters before reaching a T-junction, and it was at the junction that the squad found the first evidence of recent occupation. A folding table bearing 3 ceramic mugs, still warm to the touch. Not residually warm, not warm in the way enclosed spaces sometimes retain heat, but warm in the way a mug is warm when a hand has been around it within the last 30 minutes. Beside the mugs, spread open, as though the reader had left mid-sentence, were technical documents bearing the Aninerd double lightning insignia and a classification marking that. Fleischer went pale, identifying Hexgeheim above top secret, a designation that officially did not exist in standard SS documentation protocols, and whose existence indicated a level of institutional concealment that went beyond the Reich's standard bureaucratic paranoia. Beyond the table, through a steel door standing open, was a chamber approximately the dimensions of a modest gymnasium, walls lined, floor to ceiling with glass-fronted equipment bays still humming with electrical current, instrumentation panels still active, cables running in organized bundles from a central console to 6 reinforced steel pods arranged in a circle at the chamber center. The pods were roughly the dimensions of upright coffins. Each was connected to the console by rubber-insulated cable. 5 were sealed. The 6th stood open, its interior coated in a dark, dried substance that Dunbar identified without requiring a second look, without saying the word out loud, without looking at the men beside him to see if they had identified it too. Private Luther Emmett moved toward the open pod with the deliberate step of a man following a sound that only he could hear. Dunbar called his name once. Emmett stopped, not in the way a person stops when they hear their name, but in the way a mechanism stops when a switch is thrown, instantaneous and total, every muscle simultaneously arrested. He stood with his back to the squad for 4 seconds. Then he turned, and his expression was normal, and he said he was fine. And he crouched to examine a thin film of dust on the chamber floor near the pod's base. He was examining a footprint, a bare human footprint, pressed into the dust, pointing toward a ventilation grate in the chamber's far wall. Dunbar crossed to look at it. The footprint was fresh, the dust at its edges still settling in the faint air movement from the corridor. Then Emmett made a sound that Dunbar had heard once before in 3 years of combat, from a man whose mind had simply declined to continue processing what his eyes were reporting. A sustained, ascending sound that was not quite a scream, because it was too controlled, too internal, as if the man producing it was trying to keep it inside and failing. The footprint had acquired a companion, not beside it, ahead of it, pressed into the dust while no one in the chamber had moved, while every man present had been standing still, while the only thing that had changed in the room was the direction of their attention, fresh, deliberate, pointing, like the first one, toward the ventilation grate, except that the grate, which had been closed when they entered the chamber, was now open, and from somewhere beyond it, at a distance impossible to calculate in the enclosed acoustics of a sub-basement corridor, came the sound of something moving away from them at a pace that suggested it had been waiting for them to notice. Dunbar pulled the squad back from the ventilation grate at 14:23 hours and made the decision that every trained combat leader makes when the situation has exceeded the parameters of the original mission. He attempted to radio it up the chain. The minus 536 Seychelles rupees produced the same sustained tone on every frequency, not static, not atmospheric interference, but that single-held note unchanged since the shaft opening, as if whatever was generating it had said it and walked away and seeing no reason to adjust. Oduya spent 6 minutes cycling through every available frequency with the methodical patience of a trained signals specialist working a problem that has a solution, and then spent approximately 30 seconds sitting with the radio in his lap in the particular stillness of a man, accepting that the problem does not have a solution, and then set the radio down and looked at Dunbar and said nothing, because nothing was the accurate report. Fleischer had the unnerved documents from the folding table spread across the chamber floor, working through them with a speed that comes not from fluency, but from urgency. The German of a man who grew up, speaking it at his father's dinner table, being applied to technical language that the dinner table had not prepared him for. The translation emerging in clipped, affectless fragments that he delivered without looking up, as if looking up would cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. The project designation was Fleischkron, Fleshkron. Its stated objective, as described in the introduction, was the dauerhaft Konsolidierung kriegerischen Bewusstseins über mehrere organische substrate, the permanent consolidation of martial consciousness across multiple organic substrates, which Fleischer translated twice, slowly, at slightly different speeds, before explaining in a flat voice that it meant the attempted transfer of multiple human minds into a single functioning body. The documents referenced 23 test subjects, listed only by prisoner number. The procedure had been conducted over 18 months, beginning in November 1943, in this chamber, using the 6 pods and the central console, whose instruments were still active around them, as Fleischer read. The scientist's notes in the early entries were clinical, precise, detached, the language of men who had decided that what they were doing was science, and that science required a particular register. The language in the later entries was different. Around entry 14, Fleischer said the Germans stopped being scientific. He said it slowly, with the specific hesitation of a translator who has found words that translate accurately but wishes they didn't. It was closer, he said, to religious. The history in those documents was not the history of science. It was the history of something that science had accidentally opened a door to, and then, with the specific institutional momentum of a program that had already spent enormous resources and produced results that powerful people wanted, kept walking through. According to the operational log, the Annenerb scientists had initially believed their success was technological, that the electrical apparatus in the pods was achieving the consciousness transfer through the application of specific electromagnetic frequencies to the subject's neural tissue, a mechanism they had partially theorized and largely improvised. The belief held through 13 sessions. In the 14th session, the apparatus failed completely, a power interruption that lasted 6 hours, every instrument dead, every pod offline, and the transfer not only continued, but accelerated. Subject 14, absorbing the remaining consciousness fragments of the previous 13 subjects in approximately 40 minutes, while the equipment sat dark and inert, and the scientists stood in the chamber and watched something happen that their theoretical framework had no category for. The scientists documented this with the admirable precision of men who have been trained to document things regardless of what those things are, and what reads between the lines of their clinical German, in the increased frequency of sentence fragments, in the entries that begin mid-thought, as if the writer has been sitting in silence for an indeterminate period before resuming, is something that the document's language is not equipped to name directly, but that every man listening to Fleischer's translation in that chamber recognized immediately, because they were all feeling it too. Absolute terror, managed with professional discipline, and therefore not reduced by it. The final page of the operational log was written in a different hand, shakier, faster, the letters of a man whose fine motor control was losing its argument with whatever his body was doing in response to what his mind was processing. Its last legible sentence, in Fleischer's translation, delivered in a voice that had stopped being affectless. It knows we are here. It has always known. The equipment was never the mechanism. We were. Below it, underlined 3 times, a single word. Laufen, run. Private Emmett said, Viren Johnseed at 15:01 hours. 24, the 24th subject. He said it in a voice that was not his voice, lower in register, carrying an accent that Fleischer, who had spent his childhood surrounded by German speakers, identified as no regional German dialect he had ever heard. Something older than regional, something that predated the geographical boundaries that produce regional variation. Every man in the chamber turned to look at Emmett. He was standing against the eastern wall in the specific stillness he had maintained since touching the floor near the open pod, the stillness that Dunbar had initially read as his characteristic composure under pressure, and was now reading as something else entirely, the stillness of a system running processes that had nothing to do with the body's surface presentation. His nose was bleeding from both nostrils simultaneously, and he was looking at the 5 sealed pods with an expression of recognition so complete, so specific, so entirely wrong on a face that had no context for it, that Oduya physically stepped backward into the central console without deciding to. The pods were vibrating, not from the floor up, not the transmitted vibration of a generator or a distant impact, but from the inside out, a micro tremor originating at the pod walls and propagating outward through the floor and into the feet and up through the skeleton to the back teeth, where it registered as a frequency that none of the men had ever felt before, and that all of them would report in separate accounts produced under separate conditions, with the same involuntary word, wrong. One of the sealed pod latches moved, disengaged. The pod did not open. Something held it from within, pressing back against the now unlocked mechanism with a force that the latch housing visibly strained against, as though what was inside was in the process of deciding. Fleischer grabbed the documents and ran. He made the decision in the fraction of a second, before it became a decision. Pure body, pure animal. The part of the human organism that does not wait for the cognitive process to complete when the cognitive process is taking too long. Dunbar grabbed Emmett's arm. It was rigid, every muscle locked at maximum contraction. The body temperature through the fabric of his uniform shockingly elevated, not fever hot, but forge hot, the heat of an engine running far beyond its rated capacity. Dunbar pulled. Emmett moved, not with resistance, not with compliance, but with the neutral mobility of a structure that has been relocated rather than a person who has chosen to walk. His feet finding the floor in the correct sequence, his body maintaining upright orientation, everything anatomically appropriate and humanly absent. They ran, all 8 men. 40 meters of corridor, 9 feet of shaft, and they came up into the gray Berlin afternoon, like men surfacing from something that had been trying to keep them under, gasping not from exertion, but from the specific physiological response of organisms that had been, for the past 70 minutes, in the continuous presence of something their nervous systems correctly identified as a category of threat for which evolution had not developed an adequate response. Emmett ran with them, but he ran in perfect silence, and in the 40 meters of corridor and the 9 feet of shaft, he did not blink once. They made it to the surface at 15:12 hours. The gray overcast had not changed. The rubble field looked identical to how it had looked 72 minutes earlier, and for approximately 90 seconds, the 8 men stood in the cold April air and simply breathed, the specific, conscious breathing of people relearning that air is available, that the sky exists, that the world above ground still operates according to the physics they were trained in. Then Renshaw, who had remained at the shaft exit throughout, and had therefore not seen what the others had seen, but had spent 72 minutes alone in a bombed-out Berlin basement, listening to a radio emit a single unbroken tone while the shaft behind him radiated warmth that had no source, said quietly and without preamble that while they were below, he had heard footsteps on the ceiling, plural, moving in different directions, in a facility that the blueprints Fleischer had skimmed showed as a single sub-basement, level with no structure above it, except the collapsed foundation they were currently standing on. Dunbar looked at Emmett. Emmett was standing 3 feet from the group, oriented away from them, facing a specific point in the middle distance that contained nothing visible, no movement, no structure, no feature of the rubble field that distinguished it from the surrounding debris. When Dunbar spoke his name, Emmett turned, and for a fraction of a second, a duration that every witness would later estimate identically at less than 1 second, in separate accounts produced under separate conditions with no opportunity for coordination. There were too many expressions on Emmett's face. Not sequential, not layered. Simultaneous, occupying the same facial geometry at the same moment, as though multiple people were attempting to operate the same set of features from different sets of intentions. And the face was running all of them at once, because it had not yet received instruction about which one to present. It lasted less than a second. Then it was Emmett again. Just Emmett? His face his own, his expression the careful neutral of a man, keeping a very tight grip on his presentation. And he said in his own voice that they needed to leave, that whatever was in the pods was not staying in them, and that he remembered saying the German word, but did not know where it had come from, and did not want to discuss it. He was correct about the pods. Behind them, the ventilation shaft emitted a sound that the surviving witnesses described in 5 separate statements with 5 entirely different comparisons. A chord, a grinding, a spoken word in an unidentifiable language, the structural groan of a building approaching collapse, the sound a large animal makes when it has been waiting for a long time and has decided that waiting is over, but agree on one quality without exception. It was loud in a way that bypassed the ears entirely and registered as pressure, simultaneously in the chest and the sinuses and the base of the skull, as if the sound was not traveling through air, but through bone. Private Carver broke first, not toward the exit, not in the direction that any threat response training would have produced, but toward the shaft, which was the direction that made the least tactical sense, and that no one could account for during subsequent questioning, including Carver himself, who had no memory of making the decision and no explanation for the direction. Oduya tackled him at the shaft's edge with 4 meters to spare and held him against the rubble with the controlled force of a man who has wrestled competitively and knows how to manage a body that is fighting him. Except that Carver was fighting with a strength that Oduya described in his statement, using the same phrase 3 times and underlining it on the 3rd repetition, as not human strong but machine strong, like something that didn't get tired and wasn't using effort. Fleischer had gone to his knees in the rubble 12 feet from the shaft, the Ahnenerbe documents pressed against his chest with both arms, reciting something under his breath that the men nearest him initially registered as prayer. The rhythm was right, the cadence was right, the low urgent repetition was right, before Renshaw, who had picked up functional German from 3 months of European operations, identified it as a children's nursery rhyme, specifically Schlaf, Kindlein, Schlaf, a lullaby so common in German-speaking households that Fleischer would have heard it in childhood, which meant it was not something his conscious mind had chosen, but something his unconscious had surfaced when the conscious mind was otherwise occupied, reaching back to the earliest stored language it contained, as if depth of encoding was the same thing as safety. Fleischer later claimed, in the single conversation he had about the incident before his disappearance in 1947, that he had no memory of saying it, that he did not know he had been saying it until Renshaw touched his shoulder and he heard his own voice and did not recognize what it was doing. Emmett walked to the center of the group, moving between the struggling men with a fluid ease that was wrong for the terrain, finding stable footing in rubble that the other men were navigating with visible effort, as if the ground was offering him something it was withholding from the others, and crouched and placed both palms flat on the broken concrete. The rubble around the shaft began to vibrate at 1519 hours. Not from an explosion. No shock wave preceded it. No sound triggered it. No displacement of air accompanied it. A slow ascending tremor that started at the shaft housing and propagated outward through the debris field in a radius that the men could track by watching the dust lift from the rubble's surface in a perfect expanding circle, as though the ground was being breathed by something vast enough to use the geology of a city block as a single respiratory structure. The vibration reached the men at 1520 hours and entered them the way the sound from the shaft had entered them. Not through the senses, but through the skeleton, bypassing every trained filter they had developed for processing the physical world and arriving directly and the part of the nervous system that does not deliver it. Dunbar gave the order to move at 15:21 hours, and the squad moved, all 8, including Emmett, who rose from his crouch at the word and followed without being told twice, which was somehow more alarming than resistance would have been, because resistance would have implied a separate will, and a separate will would have implied that what was in Emmett was still Emmett. They covered 60 meters through the rubble field before Renshaw stopped and said nothing, and simply pointed east. There was a figure standing against a section of collapsed wall, 40 meters to the east. Human outline, military bearing, American uniform, correct period, correct configuration. Dunbar raised his M1 Garand. The figure did not react, did not move, did not orient toward the raised weapon, did not produce any of the reflexive responses that a living person produces when a rifle is aimed at them. Because living people have a relationship with their own survival that produces involuntary physical responses to threats, whether they intend them or not. The figure simply stood. At 40 meters it resolved, with the terrible clarity of an image coming into focus, into something recognizable as Corporal Augustine Fleischer. Same height, same build, same SCR 536 unit on its back, same worn left shoulder strap that Fleischer had field repaired 3 weeks ago with paracord in a specific pattern that no one outside the squad would have known to reproduce. Fleischer himself was standing 6 feet to Dunbar's left, his own rifle raised, staring at his duplicate with the expression of a man whose face has run out of categories. Dunbar fired twice, center mass. The double absorbed both rounds without flinching, without bleeding, without any physical response except a slow surface distortion at the impact points. The figures, exterior rippling outward from the entry wounds, like a reflection disturbed by a stone, and then resolving smoothly and completely back to stillness. The Fleischer face looked at Dunbar with an expression that had not changed through the impact of 2.3006 rounds and the killing of 2 men in 3 years of close combat. The rubble to the west moved at 15:24 hours. The rubble to the north moved at 15:24 hours. What emerged from both directions wore American uniforms and carried M1 Garands and had faces that Dunbar recognized with a physical lurch of nausea that he had not experienced in 3 years of war, because the faces were faces of men from his own unit who had died at Anzio 16 months earlier. Men whose deaths Dunbar had witnessed and reported, and in 2 cases personally confirmed. Men who were in the ground in Italy and were nevertheless here in a Berlin rebel field, walking toward his squad from 2 directions with the patient, unhurried, geometrically precise gait of things that understood encirclement as a concept and were applying it. Oduya fired. Renshaw fired. The figures absorbed the rounds with the same surface distortion and the same resolution back to stillness, and they kept coming, and the exits to the south were still open, but the south meant moving past the shaft, past the vibrating ground, past whatever had pressed both palms flat on the concrete and sent the tremor outward in a perfect circle. And 2 of the men started moving south anyway, because south was the only direction that didn't have dead men walking in it. Emmett had not moved. He was standing at the center of the squad's position, with his rifle at his side and his palms open, and he was watching the figures converge with an expression that was not fear and not calm, but something that had no name in the vocabulary of human. Emotional response, the expression of something that recognizes what it is looking at, because it has looked at it before, from the other side. The figures slowed when they reached a radius of approximately 15 meters. They did not stop. They slowed in the specific way that something slows when it is no longer closing distance for tactical purposes, but is instead maintaining proximity for another purpose entirely. And the purpose they were maintaining proximity for was the one that the Anaderb documents had described with clinical precision. Observation, 90 seconds. They needed 90 seconds. Dunbar checked his watch at 15:26 hours and found it still showing 11:47. and made the calculation that every leader makes when the available options have been reduced to the ones that are going to get people killed. And the question is no longer whether, but how many. And then the P-47 Thunderbolts came in from the northwest. They were on a close support, run 800 meters to the north. Their ordnance targeted at a Wehrmacht artillery position that had nothing to do with Dunbar's squad, or the shaft, or the figures converging from 3 directions through the mid-rubble field. A completely unrelated military action, the vast impersonal machinery of a war in its final hours executing a task that had been planned hours earlier in a command post that had no knowledge of what was happening in this specific block. The concussive wave from the first bomb impact reached the rubble field 4 seconds after detonation and hit the squad like a physical wall. 5 of the 8 men knocked off their feet, ears ringing, vision strobing. The specific total body impact of overpressure at close range. The figures stopped, all of them simultaneously, all at the same instant. Everyone frozen in mid-stride with a synchronicity that no group of living people could have produced, as if the concussive pressure had interrupted something they required for continuity, some process that the overpressure wave had momentarily disrupted, the way a power surge disrupts a system running too many processes at once. It lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Dunbar grabbed Emmett's collar. Oduya hauled Fleischer upright by his jacket. Renshaw got both arms under Carver, and all 8 men ran south, past the shaft, past the vibrating ground, past the expanding circle of lifted dust that had already begun to settle, with the specific, grim, survival-only efficiency of soldiers who have shed everything except the next step, the step after that, and the step after that. The figures did not resume movement, or if they did, they were no longer visible when the squad cleared the rubble field's southern edge at 15:28 hours and reached a position occupied by elements of the 7th Regiment who were, in the language of the report that Dunbar's company commander would file 2 hours later after, interviewing the 8 men and finding himself unable to write what they told him in any form, that military language had a Category 4, unable to account for the squad's distressed physical state or the nature of the psychological presentation observed in the returned personnel. Emmett's body temperature had normalized. He had no memory of placing his hands on the ground. He had no memory of the German word. He had no memory of the expressions that 6 separate witnesses had seen cycling across his face. And the absence of that memory was, in the private assessment of Technical Corporal Oduya, who had known Emmett for 14 months and had a better baseline than anyone. Not the absence of a man who had been unconscious, but the absence of a man who had been elsewhere and had come back and had brought something with him that was still deciding whether to stay. The officer who arrived at the 7th Regiment's position at 18:20 hours was not from the 3rd Infantry Division. He was not from any unit that Dunbar could identify, and Dunbar had spent 3 years developing the specific skill of reading unit affiliation from uniform configuration, the skill that keeps a soldier from pointing a weapon at the wrong person in a confused close-quarters situation, and this uniform defeated it. The insignia were correct in isolation and wrong in combination, the way a sentence can contain only valid words and still mean nothing. And the man wearing them moved through the regiment's position with the unhurried authority of someone who had been expected, which meant someone had called ahead, which meant someone had known where the squad would end up before the squad had known it themselves. He introduced himself as Colonel Aldous Vane. No unit, no further identification, no explanation of how a colonel with no identifiable affiliation had arrived at a forward position in a still active combat zone within 4 hours of an incident that had not yet been formally reported through any channel Dunbar had been able to access. He shook Dunbar's hand with the brief mechanical formality of someone completing a required social gesture before moving to the actual purpose of the meeting, which was to stand in front of Dunbar and ask, in a voice calibrated to carry no more than 3 feet, how many of the squad had been within 15 meters of the figures for longer than 90 seconds. The precision of that threshold, 90 seconds, the same figure from the Untold operational log, the same figure that Fleischer had translated in the chamber 4 hours earlier, told Dunbar everything he needed to know about Colonel Vane and the organization that had sent him, and how long that organization had known about what was in the sub-basement beneath the Mitt rubble field. It did not tell him what to do with that information, so he answered the question. 2 men, possibly 3, had been within 15 meters of the figures for durations he couldn't precisely measure. Vane nodded in the way that a physician nods at a test result that falls within the range he ordered the test expecting, to find not surprised, not relieved, but categorically informed. He said that examinations would be conducted. He said it the way a person says something that has already been decided. Vane's team of 12 men, none of whom spoke to the squad or responded to direct questions or acknowledged being addressed, a behavioral uniformity that went beyond discipline into something that felt more like instruction, established a perimeter around the squad's position, and conducted individual examinations that began at 18:34 hours and ran for 40 minutes. The examinations were medical in form, but not in content. Standard vital signs, STANDARD, neurological assessments, and then a series of procedures that the squad's members could not categorize, conducted with equipment that bore no manufacturer markings and produced readings on instruments that displayed no units of measurement that any of the men recognized. Emmett's examination lasted 19 minutes, longer than any other member of the squad by a margin of 11 minutes, and was conducted by 2 of Vane's team rather than 1, which was itself a form of information. Dunbar watched from 8 feet away and could see Emmett responding to questions in a voice too low to carry, his answers producing in the 2 examiners a series of small, controlled reactions, a slight pause before writing, a brief exchange of eye contact, a notation made and then written over. That were the reactions of professionals encountering data that their framework accommodated, but that they would have preferred, on some personal level, not to find. When the examination ended, one of them crossed to Vane and delivered a summary in 4 words that Dunbar, standing close enough, heard clearly. Observed. Residual. Not fixed. Vane looked at Emmett for 3 seconds without expression, and then looked away. And whatever the distinction between residual and fixed meant to Colonel Vane, it meant enough that he made a decision based on it immediately. Carver's examination produced a different result. Carver had been within 15 meters of the figures for a duration that Dunbar estimated at close to 2 minutes, during the period when Oduya had been holding him against the rubble, when Carver had been facing east, facing the Fleischer double at a range of 12 meters with nothing between them and no reason to look away. The examiner who assessed Carver spent 6 minutes on the standard procedures and then stopped and did not resume and went to Vane and spoke for approximately 90 seconds. And Vane listened with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance. And when the examiner finished, Vane said 2 words that the examiner responded to by going back to Carver and resuming the examination from the beginning, as if the first pass had been a draft, and this was the version that mattered. Carver was separated from the squad at 1901 hours. He walked with Vane's men without resistance, which was consistent either with compliance or with something that had replaced compliance and produced the same surface behavior for different reasons. Dunbar did not see him again. At 1917 hours, Vane made a radio call on equipment that bore no manufacturer markings and spoke for 4 minutes in a combination of English and what Fleischer, standing close enough to hear, close enough to go pale for the 3rd time in 6 hours, identified as Russian, functional and accented, the Russian of someone who had learned it for professional rather than cultural reasons, which in 1945, in a bombed-out Berlin forward position, carried implications that none of the men present chose to articulate out loud. When the call ended, Vane told Dunbar that an air asset would be on station in 50 minutes and that the squad needed to be at minimum 1 kilometer from the shaft location before then. He said it without drama, in the Register of Logistical Information, the same register in which a person relays a departure time or a supply, schedule, and the implication of what an air asset arriving 50 minutes after his radio call would do to a sub-basement. Beneath a rubble field settled over the squad, with a weight that compressed the available responses to a single one: movement. They moved. The 7th Regiment's vehicles covered the distance in 11 minutes, and at 19:34 hours, Dunbar checked his watch, still showing 11:47, and noted that they had cleared the 1-kilometer threshold. And someone said they should stop, and everyone got out of the vehicles, because some moments require standing up for, even when what you are standing up for is the right to watch something be destroyed. The airstrike came at 19:41 hours. A single pass, the aircraft unlit and unidentified, the ordnance impacting with a precision that indicated preloaded target coordinates rather than visual acquisition. Someone had known the exact location before the mission began, before the squad had descended, before any of this had officially happened. The shaft housing ceased to exist in the first impact. The collapsed foundation above the sub-basement followed in the second. The secondary explosions that came after were conventional in every respect. The sound and pressure and rising column of debris of things burning that were constructed to burn. And the April evening absorbed it with the indifference of a city that had been absorbing destruction for 4 years and had developed, through repetition, a relationship with it that was closer to metabolism than to reaction. Fleischer was watching the strike and said nothing during it, and said nothing for approximately 40 seconds after the last secondary detonation. Then he said, without turning from the smoke column, that the airstrike had destroyed the surface structure and the shaft and the first sub-basement level, and that the chamber, the actual chamber, 60 meters below the surface, the chamber with the 6 pods and the central console and the open grate and the footprints in the dust, was at a depth that the ordnance had not reached and could not have reached, and that everyone present knew had not been reached, because destroying the surface of a thing is not the same as destroying the thing. And the thing was 60 meters down and had been there, per the documents, since before the installation above it was built. Nobody responded to that. Vane, standing 9 meters away, may or may not have heard it. His expression, in the dying light of an April evening above a fresh bomb crater in the mid-district of Berlin, gave back nothing. The expression of a man who has long since made his private accommodation with the gap between what can be destroyed and what cannot, and has found the accommodation livable and has stopped discussing it. The squad was separated into 4 vehicles at 19:58 hours. Dunbar alone in the first, Fleischer and Oduya together in the second, Renshaw and the 3 remaining privates distributed between the third and fourth, and driven to 4 different forward positions. A geographic separation that was itself a message about the intended relationship between these men and their shared experience going forward. The processing that awaited each of them at their respective destinations was identical in structure, despite the separation. Physical examination, blood draw, psychological interview conducted by a man who wrote continuously without looking up from his notepad, and the signing of a document that each man was permitted to read for 60 seconds before it was removed. Dunbar memorized the document's final clause in the 60 seconds available, with the specific mnemonic discipline of a man who understands that 60 seconds is not an accident, but a calibration, long enough to understand what you're signing, short enough to prevent the kind of careful reading that produces questions. The clause stated that violation of its terms would constitute an act of treason under wartime statute, punishable without trial, without appeal, and without any obligation of disclosure to next of kin. He signed it. They all signed it. Then Vane's people drove east, toward the fresh crater above the shaft, toward the 60 meters of undisturbed sub-basement below it, in vehicles that, per the 7th Regiment's motor pool records, which Dunbar checked 3 days later, before those records were also amended, had never existed. The official record of April 29, 1945, is a document of remarkable administrative precision. Dunbar's reconnaissance element conducted a routine structural assessment in the Mid District, produced a standard hazard map, sustained no casualties, and returned to base at 1700 hours, 89 minutes before the 7th. Regiment's intake log places them at that position, a discrepancy that sat in an unsealed archive at Fort Meade for 31 years before a researcher named Paul Echeverria flagged it in 1976 and was subsequently transferred to a posting in Greenland whose relevance to his expertise in European theater documentation was never explained. The airstrike was logged as a routine ordnance disposal operation. The ununearthed documents appear in no inventory. Colonel Aldous Vane does not appear in any military personnel registry at any rank. Staff Sergeant Elroy Dunbar received a medical discharge in September 1945, diagnosis of combat exhaustion with dissociative features, and spent 11 years in a veterans care facility in Morgantown under a restricted access designation that his family's attorney was never able to explain or challenge. He died in 1956 of a cardiac event. He was 37 years old. Corporal Augustine Fleischer returned to Milwaukee, worked briefly at his father's hardware store, and disappeared in February 1947. No body, no note, no forwarding address, his bank account untouched. His sister's account of his final visit describing a man who sat at the dinner table for 2 hours without eating and told her, when she asked what was wrong, that he kept seeing his own face in places where his face had no business being. Technical Corporal Samuel Oduya was found dead in his Columbus apartment in March 1948. Cause of death listed as natural causes, a determination his wife disputed publicly until her own death in 1991, noting in every account she gave that her husband had been 29 years old and in excellent health, and that in the 3 years between his return from Europe and his death, he had developed one habit he had not had before. He would not allow mirrors in the house. Not covered. Removed. Private Tobias Renshaw, re-enlisted in August 1945, was assigned to a post in the Aleutian Islands, and his personnel file ends without discharge paperwork of any kind. Not closed, not transferred, simply absent after a certain date. The way a document is absent when someone has decided it should not exist, rather than when someone has forgotten to file it. Private Luther Emmett, the man who had crouched over the footprint, who had spoken in a voice that wasn't his, who had placed both palms flat on the rubble while something moved in the ground below, is listed in official military records as killed in action on April 28, 1945, one day before the incident. The paperwork was filed at 0900 hours on April 29th, 5 hours before the squad descended into the shaft, by a processing clerk whose name, when cross-referenced against the 3rd Infantry Division's personnel roster, does not appear on any enlistment record, any payroll document, or any unit photograph taken during the European campaign. The date discrepancy has been noted by 3 independent researchers over the past 4 decades. All 3 subsequently lost access to the archives in which they found it. The chamber beneath the Mid District was never excavated, never formally investigated, and never officially acknowledged. Whether Fleischkron, the thing that the SS scientists built there, apparatus around, and eventually understood they had not built at all, remains in the chamber it has always occupied, or whether the men whose faces it catalogued in 90 seconds of observation in a Berlin rubble field on a gray April afternoon were the last humans it studied, or simply the most recent, are questions that no declassified document addresses and no living official has been asked on record. What is known, because a municipal infrastructure survey conducted in Berlin in Hesse, 1987 for entirely unrelated purposes, passed sensors through the mid-subsurface and included standard geological monitoring. As part of its methodology is that the survey's instruments registered at the coordinates of the former shaft location a recurring subsurface thermal anomaly, present at every measurement interval, consistent across the survey's entire duration. Warm, in a way that the surrounding geology did not account for, as if something 60 meters below a rebuilt city, below the rubble of a war, below 4 decades of concrete and silence and official forgetting, was still running, still waiting, still at the temperature of a room that someone has recently left, or has never left, or has never needed to leave, because leaving implies that staying was a choice rather than a condition. And for whatever remains beneath the mid-district, it was never a condition. It was always just where it was. And where it was, it still is. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.